Committee members, would you please take your seats? Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the House Appropriations Transportation Environment Subcommittee, the best subcommittee in the House. And we have two agencies today. The first is MDOT WMATA, and the second is Department of Environment. We're going to start with Budget Analyst Steve McCullough, and we invite the WMATA people up to the desk, Randy Clark, the General Manager, and, of course, Secretary Wiedefeld. Go ahead, Steve.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, members of the committee. Steve McCullough from Department of Legislative Services, here to present the WMATA's fiscal 2025 analysis. On page 1, you'll see that the operating budget summary, and this is, point out, this is for Maryland's budget only. It's not WMATA's entire operating budget. But the Maryland contribution in fiscal 2025 is $489.5 million, which is a 3% increase over the current year. This does not include $150 million that the governor has included in the dedicated purpose account, which we'll be discussing a little bit later. Page 2 shows the capital budget of $353.2 million for that. If you'll turn to page 5, Exhibit 1, I'd like to start here because this is a big part of what has caused the fiscal stress for WMATA. This Exhibit 1 on page 5 shows the federal stimulus COVID funding that WMATA has received from 2020 through 2025. And as you can see, between 2020 and 2024, the current year, they received $2.8 billion to support operations as ridership declined and revenues went along with it. So that is a big thing to keep in mind. That's part of the reason for that additional $150 million that's being discussed. Page 6, Exhibit 1, shows ridership. This is kind of what we've expected, that there's a big dip during the COVID years, big increase in 2023 over the prior year, 35% increase, yet it's still 36% below pre-COVID level, which represents about 109 million fewer trips than pre-COVID. Exhibit 3 shows the performance metrics. The first two columns or sets of columns, revenue miles and passenger miles, are trending in the right direction. Those are both up. Operating cost per mile is up, which is the wrong direction for both rail and bus, but operating cost per passenger trip is down, which is trending in the right direction. And then finally, for the MFRs, page 8, Exhibit 4 shows the fare box recovery, and because fare box recovery is very closely aligned with ridership, as expected with ridership down, fare box recovery fell. But prior to that, you can see that the WMATA system as a whole recovered, close to 40% of its operating budget, and the rail system itself recovered over 50%. We'll now look at exhibit page 9 below the exhibit. Just an understanding of what this analysis looks at. This is the WMATA proposed budget as introduced, and WMATA has a similar, under its compact requirements the state has in its constitution for its budget, it has to submit a balanced budget. And because there is this 3% cap on the operating expenses that is in the Maryland and Virginia statutes, which that is why that $150 million is outside and not yet counted towards their operating budget. The budget, as the proposed budget, in order to get to that balanced, has a number of assumptions. The 3% cap that I mentioned, but it also looks at severe service cuts. Bus lines, 67 of 135 Metro bus lines would be eliminated, with service on reduced service on an additional 41. It envisions the closure of 10 Metro rail stations and service cutbacks, with rail frequency decreasing and the whole system shutting down at 10 p.m. Each night, and then turnbacks on the red and silver line. And then in addition to that, there was a 20% increase in fare and parking revenue anticipated. So That is the balanced budget required to be submitted. However, it does not account for that $150 million and what would be a corresponding increase from both Virginia and the District of Columbia. So I'm going to skip many of the budget charts here because the big change on this is really the discussion about how to fix that problem using this $150 million. But I will point out on page 12, Exhibit 8 shows the capital. Just so you're aware that in Maryland statute, there's also a requirement that the base capital increase by 3% whenever WMATA has submitted required documentation, which has been the case the last few years. And so the first three lines on that represent the base capital budget, and that does increase by the required 3% in the Maryland CTP. I will also note that in fiscal 2025 and 2026, $167 million, which has been previously general funds, have been switched over to general obligation bonds for those 2 years. This is just part of the way that things, the governor in his budget was able to maximize, the general funds for his other priorities. Looking at, turning now to page 17 is the description or the discussion of the issues. And so the big issue with this budget are those draconian service cuts and the fare increases. And I say draconian because when service cuts, there's a term in transit lingo about the death spiral. In order for transit to be successful, it needs to be frequent, high quality, dependable. That's the way you grow ridership. If service cuts are taken in the amounts proposed in the proposed budget, it's only going to affect ridership will continue to decline, which would cost further cuts in the future with more declines, and that's where you get that death spiral. So Exhibit 13 shows kind of the way out of the proposed budget. As you've all heard since last fall, WMATA was facing a $750 million shortfall in the fiscal 2025 budget, and that was caused by the withdrawal of those federal stimulus funds that have been used to support the budget that I indicated at the beginning, combined with the decreased revenues that it was bringing in on its own through ridership. So that 750, though, in the proposed budget, WMATA has identified its own cost savings, and the exhibit, the bottom of page 17, the top line shows that there's $95 million in this federal stimulus that they're actually carrying over because they made savings in the current year. They've identified $50 million in ongoing cost savings that will trickle forward, and the budget as introduced does anticipate a salary freeze for non-represented workers and represented workers. However, I will note represented workers, that will have to be negotiated through collective bargaining agreements. Point in time, that 750 was a point in time deficit, but when the budget was being readied for introduction, lower attainment of revenues in 2024 caused WMATA to also write down revenues by $67 million in the 2025 budget. That increased the deficit. They small offset with CPI inflation being moderating. And then the final kind of closing of what they could do themselves was they maximized the amount of preventative maintenance that could be funded through the capital budget, moving operating into the capital budget. That was $193 million. That leaves $433 million roughly to be solved in order for most of those, and I don't say all because there's still likely to be some service reductions and some fare increases that might be needed in order to actually get to the budget. But $433 million, the $150 million that Maryland has in its DPA account, dedicated purpose account, combined with kind of proportionate shares with Virginia and Maryland, would get close to that number and prevent many of those reductions that were being discussed. The only other issue on page 18 that I'll just briefly mention, because the committees asked for a report last session from WMATA on its transit-oriented development efforts inside Capital Beltway in Maryland. WMATA did provide that report, and Exhibit 14 on page 19 shows the lines that currently have transit-oriented development, which WMATA calls joint development projects inside the Capital Beltway in Maryland. The recommendations on page 20 is to concur with the governor's allowance for both the operating and capital. I will stop there and pause.
Well done, thank you. We'll go straight to the agency response if we can, and then we'll open it up to questions. And so we have, who wants to begin?
I'll start, if I may. Thank you.
Secretary.
Good afternoon, Chair Watson, members of the committee. For the record, Paul Wiedefeld, Secretary of Transportation. I'm joined today by Randy Clark, the General Manager of WMATA, also known as Metro. Thank you, Stephen, obviously, for the great work that you do in laying out some of these issues. Just a few opening remarks before I turn it over to the General Manager. While Metro serves the entire National Capital Region, it is also an integral part of the department's overall transportation system serving the citizens of Maryland. And we work very closely with our National Capital Region partners in the District of Columbia and Virginia to promote regional collaboration to address the challenges and the issues facing the system. Obviously, the fiscal year 25 budget has been one of those challenges. Thanks to Governor Moore's leadership, we were able to advance $150 million in fiscal year 25 budget to partially address the fiscal issues facing Metro. This commitment has resulted in both the district and Virginia contributing resources, and now the budget situation is moving toward a final resolution. Obviously, it changes day to day with that playing out, particularly in Virginia, but it is moving towards a resolution. But I do want to conclude my opening comments by saying that while we have made progress in fiscal year 25, we will need to confront future challenges related to funding for Metro as we address the much larger financial challenges facing the Transportation Trust Fund here in Maryland. So with that, I'll turn it over to Randy to talk a little bit more about his agency's program, and then we'll address the two analysts' issues.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Chair Watson. Thank you for having me here today. I'll reiterate my thanks to Governor Moore and to the Secretary for their leadership and their budget. Obviously, very much appreciated on the WMATA side. Also want to thank you all in this committee, and I had the fortune of being with the Secretary on the Senate side on a lot of meetings late on last Thursday. So very much appreciate the engagement here up in Maryland on the Metro topic. It's been about a year since I was with you all last, so I'm about a year and a half onto the job here at Metro. I will say there's a lot going on at Metro that we feel really proud of the work that we've done in the last year or so, and I'm going to take a moment to highlight a lot of those things. Ridership, and Steve has done a great job, as usual, on the analysis, so a few of these might be repetitive, but I'll try to go through them relatively quickly. 30% ridership change last year, so we do see growth happening. 2 Tuesdays ago, we had our highest peak hour that we've had since the pandemic. We also had the highest amount of federal employees back on the system. So those are very important indicators about our, if you will, our base commuter. That is really critical for both recovery of ridership, but also paid revenue from ridership, both of those categories. We've also been working, obviously, as the Secretary mentioned, with our partners and working through the ongoing budget piece. As we work through the ridership and other aspects of Metro, I do want to highlight that overall customer satisfaction at the system has gone up. We are currently at the highest customer satisfaction we've had in the history of Metro on the rail side at 88%, and on the bus side we're at 77%. So every quarter we've grown in the last year and a half, and I'm really proud of the team. Many of those team members live in Maryland, delivering a great job for the region and for our customers. We also continue to focus on fare evasion. It's a topic that continues to come up, probably the topic that I actually hear about the most. We're also laser focused working with our partners on overall public safety. I'm happy to report on public safety side, our crime is down about 13% year over year. We actually have over 100 special police officers in the system complementing our transit police department. Last year around this region, everyone knows there was just a significant amount of crime, especially on auto thefts and other factors like that did drive the crime rate a little higher. I've already, I believe it is, in the last 6 months, our auto thefts are down 50%, so we got a kind of targeted focus on those. We do believe that every day and every week we are making the system safer with all of our public safety efforts. One of those aspects has also been our new gates that we've retrofitted our stations to prevent people from, walking over or getting through the gates. Every place that we've modernized our fare gates, we're seeing somewhere around a 70%, sometimes even higher, reduction in fare evasion. Now, that's not perfect, obviously, everywhere, but it is making a pretty big difference. We also have targeted fare evasion teams. We average 7 to 9 fare evasion teams out on the system every single day. We also set up a program called Metro Lift, and the idea is if you're on SNAP in any of the 3 states, you will immediately qualify for 50% reduction in fare. And so our message is really simple. If you need a hand up and you're on SNAP, we're here to help you enroll, and you can get more affordable transportation around the region. However, if you can afford to pay, we need you to pay your fair share and act civil and responsible on the system for everyone's benefit. It is the community's assets, and we ask everyone to do that. Regarding the budget itself, Steve mentioned it is complex because we had a proposed budget out in December, and that was my obligation as a general manager to put out an actual balanced budget because we have a federal compact that says that. Obviously, as the Secretary referenced, we've made significant strides, as I mentioned, Governor Moore's leadership, but also leadership in D.C. and in Virginia. Looking towards that we might have a total of about $480 million in additional investment this year that would actually help close our budget deficit and replace a lot of that federal, COVID stimulus money. So that 480 really kind of resets, and then about 2 weeks ago, we put out a revised general manager's budget. Steve mentioned a couple of these things, but a few things I want to highlight. We at the team believe we have to try to save every single penny. If we're going to ask others to be part of the investment plan, then we have to look, under every couch cushion, as you will, the old saying. We believe we've found $50 million of internal administrative efficiencies. Now, I'll caution that we now have to go implement that in July, and that's reoccurring. So to save $50 million without touching service is very complex in a place that is mostly driven by service, but we feel obligated and responsible to do that, so we're working on that. We will have to do a shift to preventive maintenance. That is certainly something we do not want to be doing. It is a very unhealthy way to run the organization long term. There is relief from the federal formula funding to kind of do that from time to time in a crisis. Obviously, this is being a crisis scenario, but that will ultimately hurt us and drive in our debt financing, so it'll eventually impact our capital program. We also are going to do 0 raises for representative, and I put in the budget non-representative employees. I want to make sure I highlight that is no way an indication of the value, I think, of our employees at our organization. Quite frankly, I think it's actually the opposite. I think our staff has done an incredible job kind of recovering from COVID, delivering amazing customer satisfaction, a great system for our community. But we all feel, again, that it's something we have to do from an obligation point of view, shared sacrifice. On the service point of view, while we are looking like we might avoid draconian cuts, we still have targeted cuts. And we're going to run a lot more 6-car trains than 8-car trains. That is opposite of what this region has been working for about 20 years to run all 8-car train sets. But we think that for a short period of time, we can be a little bit more cost efficient with 6-car train sets. I will say that is going to eventually catch up to us, obviously, as ridership continues to recover. So that is, again, not a long-term solution. We also are going to do a shorter peak window. So we used to run about a 4-hour peak window, with, i.e. more service during the peaks. We are going to shorten that to a little over 2 hours. Again, not a long-term solution, but something we're hopeful in 25 we can squeeze through. We also are recommending to the board, ultimately the board has to approve a budget in April, a 12.5% fare increase. What that would really do is move our base fare from $2 to $2.25, and on weekends it would go up to $2.50 because of the cap. At 12.5%, it almost aligns perfectly with nominal fare adjustment since 1976. So if you look at actual inflationary growth since 1976, 12.5% gets us almost the exact on both short, long-haul trips and the average trip. We also have a $95 million savings, as been discussed. I want to highlight again, and I think Steve has done this, but that will not be here in FY26. So if all things are the exact same in FY26, we will either need to have the jurisdictions help us with that $95 million proportionally as the formula, or we will have to do some type of cut. But that's for another day, obviously, but just want to put that out there. The budget process is full earnest at Metro. We have public process starting, I think, in Maryland on February 26th. We welcome people to submit comments and let us know what they think. Lastly, I want to highlight that we are building our new rail car fleet here in Maryland, our 8,000 series rail cars in Hagerstown. It's a Hitachi rail factory. We're really excited. This will allow us to get rid of our 3,000 series trains. Our 2,000 series trains, we look like we're going to start taking those off the line later this spring as our 7,000 series trains return. We found that issue that happened with the NTSB, and we're moving that program forward. But we look forward to getting rid of the 3,000 series cars with the new beautiful 8,000s, and they're going to be much more reliable, much safer, and lead to a much better commute for the next 40 years for everyone around the region. We have what's called a soft mock-up vehicle, so basically something that doesn't go on tracks but representative of the vehicle. It's being delivered right now on a boat. It should be at the Port of Baltimore, I believe, in the next week or two. And then soon to be announced a very interactive and engaged process for the public to come and see the new 8,000 series car, and we'll be announcing that for late March. Very family-friendly event to come out and see that. Outside of that, I welcome any comments and questions, and again, thank you for having me here today.
Thank you for your presentation. Do we have questions from members? Delegate Solomon, why don't you start us off?
Thank you, Madam Chair. It's good to see you both. And Mr. Secretary, thank you for your service to Metro in your previous role. And Mr. General Manager, it's good to see you. Obviously, I'm slightly biased here. I've got 8 Metro stations either immediately in my district or nearby. And I think, as most folks know, there's some really great stats in particular about sort of the compact area and the economic benefits and just the huge economic powerhouse that we see immediately around stations. Just in Montgomery County, 30% of our total jobs, despite 2% of the landmass being within a half a mile of a metro station, it's 132,000 jobs, and almost 25% of all of our businesses in just our county, largest jurisdiction in the state, are within half a mile of a metro station. So the maintaining and good operations of the system are not just important for getting people from point A to point B. It's literally the economic lifeblood of the largest jurisdiction in the state. The two of the largest jurisdictions in the state, Montgomery and Prince George's, but obviously is a huge benefit to Anne Arundel, which I think is the 3rd highest ridership in the state behind those two. And the last thing I want to point out before I get to my questions, is obviously it mentioned in here in 2019 your fare box recovery was about 52%. And I'll give you credit for that because that's when you were there. That's actually above average of heavy rail around the country. So we talk a lot, I think, generally about what are we subsidizing, transit versus roads. We heavily subsidize our roads, and obviously Metro was doing its part pre-pandemic to make sure they were getting the money from their riders. And obviously that 12.5% increase, which I do want to ask you about, we're not raising tolls by 12.5%. At least nobody's talking about that. So that's going to fall on the backs of the folks who really can least afford it in the D.C. region and really around D.C., obviously folks who are commuting.
And you're getting to your questions.
Yes. Isn't that so? Thank you. Question about federal money. Can you tell me a little bit about sort of the ongoing conversation? I know there had been a mention of trying to shift some of the SMART benefits, and obviously we're at the mercy of not only Virginia and D.C., but the federal government that plays a huge role.
Yeah, well, first of all, Senator, thanks for your comments. And yes, wherever Metro goes, the community clearly flourishes and grows. On the federal question, we have had some ongoing conversations at OMB and OPM. Obviously, our job is not to tell any employer how they should be in the office or not in the office. We want to make that crystal clear. With that said, we certainly welcome more people back on the system. Federal employees specifically make up such a big part of the ridership base and economic activity in our region. So we are kind of encouraged and hopeful that the recent signs show more and more people will be on the system. Part of the comments or conversations we've had with them would be around the idea that we used to generate almost $100 million more in revenue from federal employees because they may have used the system, say, 3 or 4 times a week, or like 3 or 4 days a week. And all those trips generated revenue. Now, if people are only working 1 day a week or 2 days a pay period, we are emphasizing that the system is still there 7 days a week, must be maintained 7 days a week. So we can't have track and power and signals for Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and that's just not for the federal government. That's across the region. The whole system has to work 365. And so one of the conversations would be is there a way to make sure that everyone that used to spend money from a federal employee point of view could still be contributing? Because in some way it was almost like a federal operating component of our budget. It wasn't designed that way, but in some ways it acted that way. Secondarily, and I give a lot of credit to the 4 senators, Virginia and Maryland in this case, are really talking about the idea of Metro is a very unique transit system where we really are kind of the fabric of the national security apparatus in many ways. We work with Secret Service, FBI, Capitol Police, let alone MPD, on not just major events, but daily operations. And in many ways, we have I think the second largest canine team in the region. A good example is the pipe bomb that was found outside the Capitol on January 6th. That was our canine that hit that device and rendered it. So we do a lot of national security because of where we are. And so one of the kind of conversations is there a way that the federal government should be maybe looking to fund some of our unique security requirements because we are so different than other transit agencies. So our conversations are good. Quite frankly, we're just looking to try to move that conversation along as best we can and, again, find the most creative ways to make sure the system is healthily funded.
And then sort of more broadly on the budget piece and how you're going to fill some of the gaps. So I was hoping you could talk a little bit more about how you got to the 12.5%, what you think that will look like. Obviously, the SNAP piece is helpful, but there's a middle income group of folks that are going to be hit by this who don't qualify, obviously, for those kind of supports. And then we're going to hear from ATU. Obviously, that's a proposal. How do you actually plan on working with labor to get us to the wage freeze? Because if we don't get it, obviously, we've got to fill that gap.
Yeah, so I guess 2 questions there. So first, on the fare proposal, in the initial proposal, I put down 20% because we really had zero money identified. 12.5 kind of lines us up with inflationary growth. I think there's a general feeling for most people that Metro has to acknowledge. So I think would be duplicitous for us to tell people you have to recognize Metro's inflation on the cost side, but then not say that we should have inflation on the revenue side. So we're trying to be at least consistent on our philosophy around that. But we do have to be eyes wide open that the people that are going to pay fares are generally people that are at least at the lower to medium income point of view. So again, take a worker that is, say, a federal employee with a smart trip benefit, they're getting covered anyway. So we do want to get a higher revenue from anyone that's getting that covered. It will impact ridership. There's no question about it. So we still anticipate ridership. We are moving in the right direction on recovery. But anytime we raise fares, there is obviously elasticity there. These are models, though, and a lot of these models, pre-COVID models, are, I think we got to be honest that I don't want to say it's throwing a dart, but the accuracy of these models needs to still, I think, need a few more years to filter out. But yeah, there is this gap that people are going to have to pay more, and that is a challenge. And I think people would say, on one side say it's only fair, and on the other side someone would say, but gas didn't go up 12.5 cents, so why is transit, if that helps with better policy goals like environmental or economic inclusivity? So again, these are more policy kind of questions. Our job is to propose, and ultimately the board will make a decision in April on that final piece.
And Delegate Solomon, you had 2 questions. I'm going to go to someone else, and then I'll come back to you. Delegate Mangione.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you both for being here. You mentioned some of the crime numbers, and it seems that things are trending in the right direction, which is good. I'm wondering, do you have, I guess, ridership surveys of the correlation between whether somebody uses the Metro or not based on the crime element?
Yeah, hi, Senator. Good question. So we do surveys. Surveys right now show probably one of the highest rated concerns of people is the perception of public safety. Now, perception and reality of public safety are not the same thing. We are obviously in a society bombarded with public safety noise all day long. That's not to say we don't have legit public safety concerns as a society. Wherever we have more police presence, people feel better on the system. And so what we've really decided to do, we have over 30,000 cameras in Metro. We brought in a crisis intervention team, so we've hired up to 10 people on the system that really go around and help people, maybe experiencing homelessness or drug or alcohol addiction issues. And then we've really flexed in our special police and officers to be much more visible out on the system. So we do think that's A, lowering crime, and B, making people feel more comfortable. I personally think that there's an upside on ridership as we continue to get the DMV a little safer. I think more and more people are going to continue to, go back out and do things like that.
That's great. Well, and I think Madam Chair mentioned something about so the WMATA, the operating money, you don't get anything from the federal government for operating, or?
There's no
even with all the sensitive security issues that you were kind of mentioning, the federal government does not give money towards some of those security measures?
That's correct, but I want to be clear on the record here that there's a significant contribution on the capital side from the federal government. So both formula, which without formula we wouldn't be able to kind of go into this preventive maintenance capital bank in some ways, and two, there's a special program called PREA, which is an authorization just for Metro for capital state of good repair. The challenge with some of these programs is, especially PREA, a good example, it was never indexed. So while PREA is very important, and we very much appreciate our congressional delegation specifically that works on this topic, it's lost about almost 30% of its purchasing power since that enactment happened. So they'd be kind of like Social Security today being 30% less valuable if it wasn't indexed to CPI.
Great. Well, thank you for your answers.
Thank you.
Delegate Edelson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Great to see you both. I don't have much of an ego, so you can just call me delegate. You don't have to refer to me as senator like my colleagues.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Okay, we like the upgrade.
They might have appreciated
I've been a
the
three-state whirlwind of government affairs in the last week and a half. I apologize.
Yeah, exactly.
Touche.
I don't want the demotion. Okay. So first question I have for you is, great to see you, and thank you for everything you're doing. On ridership versus fare box recovery, when I look at the charts provided by Mr. McCullough, I see a substantial increase in ridership, particularly on Metro bus, I guess rail as well, but just looking now on Metro bus between 22 and 23. But it appears as though the fare box recovery remains at 7% for both years. Is there any, can you give us an understanding of why such a substantial increase in ridership would not result in an increase in fare box recovery?
Yeah, so two things on that, delegate, would be one, methodology-wise, we now have an ability at Metro on the rail side to differentiate between someone paying and not paying. And we needed the new gate technology that really only got done in for the 2023 cycle. So that's like the first year we really have that data. And on the bus side, we're actually doing a massive bus replacement program, fare box replacement. I think we're just over 60% done. So both the gates and the boxes on the buses will all be done by this summer. And in the last month, we've actually started seeing more revenue and more taps on the bus side because the boxes are working. We're also doing a significant more enforcement on the bus side. So A, ridership is growing. B, we got to get more people to pay. I will say on fare box recovery, I would caution the word, and I'm not saying your word on this, but others, which is there's no good or bad on that. That's a policy decision. So higher versus lower doesn't, in my opinion, mean that's good or bad. You could take a transit agency that has zero fare, and I'm not saying that's good or bad either, but then they clearly have a zero fare box recovery because they made a policy decision. Sure. And I just use that for meaning our business is not monolithic, so it's all about the policies we're trying to activate.
I get it. I understand. I was just trying to understand the correlation between a substantial increase in ridership and a seemingly flat increase in fare box recovery.
Especially on the bus side. We definitely got to get better recovery on the bus side, and we're really flexing in on that. There's also a bill currently in D.C. related to fare evasion. The gentleman to my left, when he was the general manager, this was a piece of legislation that happened in 2019. And it changed the law in D.C. It makes it much more difficult for us to do fare evasion, fare enforcement, I should say. And right now, giving the mayor, Councilmember Pinto, and lots of others a lot of credit, they're moving a bill forward that we hope will allow us to enforce just like we do in Maryland starting about another month.
Got it.
The delegate. If I may, just one other thing, because it impacts MTA Baltimore as well. As you know, during COVID, we were not collecting fares. We were letting people enter the bus without paying. So that became, almost a cultural, sort of issue. So it's also dealing with that issue as, reminding people that now they have to pay. But, for almost 3 years, you had people that did not. Some people that are just starting to use the system. They just had never paid. That's playing out as well.
Understood. I appreciate that. On the chart that Mr. McCullough provided about the savings and then, let's just say lack of savings, on the lower attainment for FY25, that's $67 million lower than projected. Can you give us a sense of page 17? I apologize, Exhibit 13. Can you give us a sense of what those numbers are a result of?
Oh, Delegate, on page 17, are you referring to the 67 million, which is the FY25 revenue adjustment?
Yes.
So basically that referring to when we put this out, and we're hoping this, as we get P&L for the month, we're hoping this is starting to break and go the opposite direction. Yeah. This was basically that we are not seeing the ridership recovery, and specifically the revenue from ridership recovery. And part of that's two reasons. One, long haul trips, if you will. And again, I always try to clarify, that doesn't mean a trip going into DC. That could be, DC to a Dulles Airport. It could be DuPont Circle to Greenbelt, as an example. They don't have to be into DC. It's just length of trip. Right now we would get $6 for that recovery, whereas a short trip is $2. Right. So bus ridership has gone really well, but it's the $2. We're getting more short to medium trips than long. Now we're starting to hope, because especially the federal workers coming back more, that will even out. The other thing is we've grown a lot of ridership in the evening and on weekends because we had a $2 flat fare. And so, yes, ridership went up because we're basically at pre-COVID levels on the weekend, but obviously that revenue isn't as high because of $2. So again, it's this blending of fares and time. So that's why they don't perfectly correlate.
Got it. This final question, if I may. I know it's early in the year, but we always see you early in the year. Do you have a sense of January, February ridership of 24 versus 23?
Yeah, so far going in the right direction. As I mentioned 2 weeks ago, so this time of year, there's a lot of seasonality. And then obviously post-COVID world, if someone thinks there's going to be 1 inch of snow, it used to be in DC 1 inch of snow was let's please don't go to work. Now it's almost an immediate let's don't go to work. So there is some seasonality here, but 2 Tuesdays ago, we saw our largest 8 to 9 a.m. base. Yesterday, we actually saw a really strong Sunday. The other thing that's unique is we do a lot of track work in January and February specifically, so we can be track work free for 5 straight weeks for cherry blossom, which is the heaviest amount of ridership throughout the entire year. So that suppresses a little bit, but overall trends, we're starting to see fare evasion down and more people at trips during the peak hours, which is both really healthy signs.
Great. Well, long may it continue. Thanks so much for your
thank
work.
you.
Thank you, Delegate. And Delegate Ruff. Or would you like me to go with Metzger?
I'm good.
Okay, go ahead.
Go with my boy first.
Okay.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I had a quick question as it relates to the measures you've taken to avoid fare evasion. Is there a kind of a dollar figure? Is that cost savings, making any kind of dent in the issues, the budgetary issues that we were highlighting today, or is it more just trying to recover as much back that has been lost over COVID?
Yeah, great question, Delegate. So, one, I think it's important that we say every dollar matters. Mm-hmm. With the caveat, I think to the general theme of your question, it will not solve the large structural issue that basically has been identified for 45 years at Metro.
Yeah, I'm just trying to get an understanding of what kind of impact it would make.
Yeah, well, we have all of our charts and if this isn't enough, Charlie Scott, I should have mentioned, is with me. Most people know Charlie Scott. He's our government affairs manager in Maryland. We can go and get more detailed of kind of fare evasion and overall dollars, but we're talking in the millions to tens of millions overall, certainly not in the hundreds of millions in relation to the overall budget and especially on the operating and capital side combined. So we're going to do everything we can to recoup every dollar because there's also a fairness aspect that people want to see as well that we think is really important.
Yeah. And then my last question, I'm sure some of my colleagues might be following up on this, but obviously it's not lost on us, the comments coming out of Virginia as far as the Senate is concerned. And I'm wondering if you have gotten feedback on their critiques about the operations and, what it would take for them to be convinced to do what our body, at least on the House side, has done already in, contributing to making sure that we can, as much as possible, try to alleviate the budgetary issues that we're facing.
Yeah, on that question, Delegate, I guess what I would say to that, I don't think it's my role to question the political process inside the, especially crossover session inside of Virginia. I will say the following. I think we feel good about how we're running this organization, and I think the statistics prove that we're going in the right direction on many fronts. I want to thank the Northern Virginia delegation specifically, who's carried multiple budget amendments, both on the House side and there's a lot of work going on in the Senate. I think there's a pretty solid support from the entire Northern Virginia delegation related to Metro's funding and where we're at. And also reference, we've had pretty detailed meetings with Governor Youngkin. And just 2 weeks ago, I believe his quote was, "I have confidence and impressed by the management of Metro." So, we're doing everything we can to provide transparent, honest data and have conversations with anyone in the entire Virginia political sphere about Metro. And we're just going to try to continue to run the operation as best as we can and work with them that way.
Understood. And I think I heard that from you in your presentation. What I'm trying to understand is just kind of what is your sense of what their critiques are and whether or not there's any merit to it?
Well, I guess I'll go to the latter. I feel very good about how we're running the organization. I feel that we are doing a good job. I think lots of others are indicating the same thing. And again, I think it's up to the elected representatives of Virginia to do their budget negotiations, and I guess I'll defer to them on that.
Okay. I guess that's an answer to my question.
I'm sorry, I'm trying the best I can to answer your question. Yeah.
All right. Thank you.
Delegate Metzger.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'll try to rephrase this, but thank you, Mr. Clark, for being here, and your associate's been trying to get a picture. I told him, get down here and take it this way. My question, this is why I like sitting next to Delegate Ruff here. He pretty much took my question, but I'll ask it a different way. What if the other two jurisdictions don't come through with their fair share? What do we do?
Well, I think, maybe the Secretary wants to jump into this as well.
Basically, Delegate, we would go by the formula, and whatever dollars come up, and we have a commitment in the formula, and we'll match that formula. But in effect, we're not going to cross-subsidize to other jurisdictions that have come up with their dollars.
It pretty much answers your question. Thank you.
And I'll follow up with that. I think also what Delegate Ruff is getting at is there's been criticism recently, even in our committee, of some members of the House who believe that WMATA has not done enough to curb expenses in the past. And you have very nicely laid out what you're doing now. And I think what we're trying to get at is, what do you say to those people who criticize WMATA for not controlling expenses over time? And are you saying that you have controlled expenses, not you personally, but WMATA has controlled expenses as much as possible over time? Or are you saying we're really facing what we consider to be a perfect storm here between COVID and ridership and inflation? So how do you respond to that criticism, which we are hearing about your expenses?
Sure, valid point, Chair. So one, I would start at the latter part, which is, it is clearly a perfect storm. So in many ways, Metro's was really impacted by inflation, at maybe much higher than most organizations. Our collective bargaining agreement led to pretty significant adjustments for our representative employees. Again, not saying that wasn't earned. Just want to be clear on the math of that. That was a 21% increase over 3 years compounded for our union representative workers. Then Metro gave a credit in 2020 to the 3 jurisdictions. So if you take those two plus the very significant drop in ridership and therefore ridership revenue, all of those things add up to take a structural issue that has been around in Metro forever and really just put it all on the table at the same time. The gentleman beside me ran this organization for 7 years, was it Paul? 7? And I think rightfully did a lot of hard work, bringing in a lot of costs, hundreds of employee positions eliminated, consolidation of real estate, leases, things of that nature. What we've tried to do with the organization now is take that next level and see, is there anything else left? I tell this to people all the time. I know it sounds convenient to talk about administrative costs. There's not much left at Metro to really touch. And part of that is it won't be very structural anyway. So hypothetically, let's say we have 16 people in the payroll department. and somehow we get it down to 14, it's not going to change the actual math at Metro, right? We need to use advanced technology and move into much more efficient operations long term, like you would see in Europe and Asia, if we want to fundamentally change the overall cost structure of the organization. And that's going to require a major capital investment to get to look like a different type of agency long term. So that's a digitalization of the entire organization. The last thing I'd say is we are very happy to sit down with any delegate, any senator, anyone else, go through all of our stuff. And if someone has a great idea that we can further reduce costs and be better, where there's no pride of authorship, we will take those ideas.
Thank you. And you mentioned the labor contracts, you mentioned the 2020 credit, you mentioned ridership, but there's one thing you didn't mention. Inflation.
I'm sorry, the inflation really hit us the highest on the labor side.
Okay.
That because of the contract. Obviously, it also hit us with parts and commodities and
Right.
those pieces.
Right.
Those have kind of normalized a bit. But I use the inflation to talk mostly about the labor side, just because that's where the biggest amount of the inflation part was.
Understood. And Mr. Secretary, we might ask you, back in 2018, I think, when they passed this original cap that is on the 3%, were you involved in that? So can you tell us, by your recollection, why they ended up with 3% as a cap?
Yeah, to be totally frank with you, I had to count votes. Had to bring Richmond, district, and Annapolis together. And Richmond was very concerned about the cost growth of the organization. So I had proposed capping it at 3% per year to try to put pressure on both the agency and some of our negotiations, whether it's with employees or contractors, and to try to drive that cost down and keep it as low as we possibly could. And that's the basic logic of how that deal to be struck. Remember, that was in return for a dedicated funding for the capital, so we can make these improvements that had been put off for decades.
Right.
And that was in effect the quid pro quo.
At the time, though, what was the inflation rate?
I don't recall.
Less than 3%.
Yeah,
It
could
was
have been
2.5% or so.
Yeah.
So in the last couple of years, we've seen inflation between 6 and 8%. So it is hard to imagine that you could keep those costs below 3% in an environment where inflation is much higher. Delegate Solomon.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just changing gears a little bit, one of the things that I was a little dismayed about, and I did just want to address Delegate Mangione, your team has been really helpful, particularly in Wheaton, where we have had some crime issues. The transit police have been really great in working with our local police department and with local businesses to make sure that everybody's in communication, and I wanted to acknowledge that and say thank you. And I'm a regular Metro rider in my other job when I have to go downtown, and I've had nothing but great experiences. One of the things that I was a little dismayed about is we've lost now 2 inspector generals pretty quickly in succession. Obviously, the last one resigned, or his contract was not renewed in November, and we still have an acting inspector general. So can you talk a little bit about what's the future of the office and how we're going to get to a place where we don't seem to be losing them pretty quickly?
Yeah, with that question, Delegate, I would really have to have you defer to the board. I wasn't involved in anything to do with the Inspector General decision for him leaving or related, and that the other person was gone before I got here. That is 100%. Management has 0 role with the OIG office. That is between the board and the board and the OIG.
I was going to say, not to put you on the spot, Mr. Secretary, but as one of the as somebody who appoints our representative to the board, can you comment on that?
It is a concern of mine. I think the OIG plays an important role there, particularly when you think of some of the dollars that are flowing through that organization. So I know when I was there, that was one of my big focuses is make sure we follow the dollars. Yes, there's other operational things of nature, but at the end of the day, you're bringing in hundreds of millions of dollars right into this organization, and we got to make sure that it's being spent both wisely and obviously no fraud and abuse. So that had always been my philosophy, and to support the OIG to do that. There's some personnel issues, that have played out. That's a different issue. But in terms of the value of what the OIG brings to that organization, I think it's very important.
I don't know if you have the answer to this, and maybe your team can follow up with us on it. Do you have a sense, or do you know when that acting position is going to go permanent, whether it's the current acting OIG or whether there's going to be a permanent hiring.
I believe they're actually advertising it right now.
My understanding is there's a recruitment going on, and what we could do is have Charlie maybe follow up with the board office to then have the board send you something on that.
And then last question, this is more to you, Mr. Secretary. So I think one of the other issues that keeps coming up, obviously, is we seem to be in a position where we're talking about long-term metro funding every 5-10 years. And I know one of your priorities, and I think this body in general, is in the next year or two, getting us to a place where we don't need to keep having this recurring conversation. So I know there's a lot of conversations in the works about this, and we're at the mercy of our partnership with the other jurisdictions. But maybe you can comment on sort of your thoughts or the administration's thoughts on longer term, how do we fix this so we're not here again in 5-10 years?
There's two issues that are playing out. One is on the growth of the operating cost, right? And the nature of the business, which is purely operating, 70+% is operating. And so those costs will go up, and particularly if they go up with inflation, they go up dramatically. Obviously, we've had historic levels recently. The other component of this is when we got the dedicated revenue source, it was capped at $500 million. And the condition of the system was in such poor shape that what we did is we basically used up, in effect, that financial capacity. And in the 28-29 timeframe, there is relatively little financial capacity there on the capital side. Now, we've invested. We went from, when I first started there, we were spending $600 million a year. And when I left there, last 3 years I was there, we were spending about $2.2 billion. And it's in that range now, I believe. Yeah, 2.4. So that is all where you saw Safe Track and the platforms and all that heavy work that was done. But the cost of that, meaning the future cost of that, was we had to use up all that capacity. And that dedicated funding, I tried to get a mechanism that would grow that. But again, at the time, that was not, it was not doable. So those two issues are coming at us. And then I think we got to blend in, obviously, the other transit systems we support in the state to start to wrestle with this issue. So that's why it's been referred to as this larger structural issue that we'll have to deal with the trust fund.
Thank you, Delegate Solomon. Delegate Mangione, you've got 2 minutes, and then we'll end with Delegate Metzgar.
Just real brief, kind of just a follow-up to that, I guess, is obviously there's real budgetary issues here. What's the guarantee that because when I see stuff like this, my first concern just kind of from outside looking in would be safety issues. Like, what guarantees are there? And I know accidents happen, obviously, but in terms of the long-term maintenance and just making sure that there are no potential issues and daily ridership. I mean, the amount of moving parts between rail and bus, just want to make sure there are no shortcuts there.
Yeah, no, thank you, Delegate. It's literally the core value. I used to be a former chief safety officer. It is what our team is focused on in every single day. As the Secretary said, the system is in a much better state of good repair than it was a decade ago. It's like, especially 5 years ago, quite frankly, it's much better state of good repair. As we get our older trains out and we get the new trains, that will either further increase. Now, with that said, it is a very big, complex system, and on a daily basis, there's a lot of moving variables, most of which we can't control, weather, people's behavior, things of that nature. But if you look at actually National Transit Database, we are either at or above average on every single safety category of every rail system in the country. And last year we met or beat every one of our internal safety metrics. So it is something all we do is think about on a daily basis, how to become safer and make it a best experience for everybody.
Thank you.
Delegate Metzger, last question.
There you go. Delegate Solomon and Delegate Mangione both pretty much put my questions in one set of assurances or guarantees. So I'll just say, what assurances are we going to have that we're not back here year after year? And I guess I'm trying to really zero in on this because I need to hear it, that we've got to get it fixed. As Secretary knows that I use this word, I'm tired of kicking the can.
Yeah, so Delegate, just to make sure to clarify, you're asking, are we be back here to talk about budget issues?
Right.
I would say unless we do a real solve to the structural issue, I'm guaranteeing we will be back to talk about the budget issues. We have to come to grips as a region that we have an upside-down model. It was identified in 1976 as literally the same month the system opened. We have to come to grips with what we want to do from a policy framework and then fund that predictably and healthily going forward. Otherwise, we will, whether it's 1 year, 2 years, or 5-year cycles, we will continue to do this rinse and repeat until we actually have that predictability.
So essentially, what you're saying is we need to go back to square one and fix it right.
I've been here 18 months, and in my opinion, we fundamentally should have a very serious conversation about changing the compact. Compact was put together in the 60s. We are not a region of the 60s anymore. We're a much more dynamic, much more activity center driven region. There's challenges related to funding. There's challenges related to governance. There's challenges related to operations, fleet planning. As I think the Secretary highlighted really importantly, we have operating and capital, both needs. There's a lot of other transit operators in the region that all have similar issues that we should try to actually structurally look at what our transit network is, not just WMATA. So in my opinion, we whether it's start from fresh is one way to look at it, but I think we should have a comprehensive look and not just a partial look.
So let me ask it this way and just be honest, because I'm transparent, but do you think that we're not really willing to take and listen to the conversation and have the conversation, or do you think it's just good politics just to keep on asking?
No, I think I've been really feeling more optimistic every month that I'm here that people are kind of tired about talking about Metro's financial stuff. And I think people like your representative are saying, like, let's just fix this once and for all. I think, the challenge is there's no other organization like it in the country because we have, a 3-state plus federal government complex model. And if it was easy, probably someone would have fixed it over the last 45, 50 years. So is it possible? Of course it's possible to fix it. We have to have that regional conversation. And that's going to take a lot of leadership and a lot of transparency and a lot of people working together. And I remain very optimistic that we can do that.
Whatever I can do to help you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you both very much for your presentations. We have 2 members from the public that would like to testify, and the first is Matthew Girardi from the Amalgamated Transit Union Local 689, followed by Lindsay Mendelson from the Maryland Sierra Club. Mr. Girardi.
Thank you, Chair Watson and members of the committee. My name is Matthew Girardi. I'm the Political and Communications Director for ATU Local 689. Local 689 is comprised of more than 15,000 members, including 9,000 hardworking WMATA employees. Since 1916, our union helped turn low-wage, exploitative transit jobs into transit careers. We became an engine for the middle class of this region. To start, the union and its members applaud Governor Moore's budget proposal for increasing Metro funding by $150 million. However, we must note to fully fund the system, Maryland would need to provide $209 million for the next fiscal year. Now, the authority is currently proposing to balance the budget through 3 main measures. The first, setting indefinite wage freezes for frontline transit workers. Second, as you heard from the CEO and general manager, raising fares by at least 12.5% and up to 25%. And the third is transferring over $165 million in preventive maintenance funds over to the operating side. We believe that these cost savings would be devastating and are a gamble with the lives and livelihoods of all that depend on Metro. Fare increases hit working people the hardest and are regressive. Likewise, wage freezes for transit workers, while Metro has already had to pay bonuses to attract talent amidst a national CDL shortage, is an idea that is likely to drive away potential new talent while making it more difficult to maintain existing workers. Being a transit worker is hard. Increases in antisocial behavior, violence, and COVID over the past few years have made it that much harder. Making wages less competitive with no end in sight would be demoralizing to working people who have been the frontline workers to frontline workers, getting people around this region each and every day. Finally, major transfers from preventive maintenance invites catastrophe, as we saw just earlier last week at Eastern Market. Workers, riders, and the whole region depend on a robust and functional transit system. Putting its technical soundness on lease to cover the bills today is a colossal gamble that puts all of us in jeopardy. The union requests that this committee fully fund Metro and do not allow these cost measures to come to pass. $209 million, again, is needed to ensure that our members can continue to provide the the world-class service and so that WMATA does not become a mid-tier commuter system. If not, we believe that this is effectively balancing the budget on the backs of working people. We implore this committee to not move forward with it. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Mendelson?
Thank you, members of the committee. My name is Lindsay Mendelson. I'm the transportation representative with the Maryland Sierra Club. The Maryland Sierra Club has over 72,000 members and supporters across the state of Maryland. And I'm here to urge the committee to push for full proper funding for WMATA in addition to MTA and the locally operated transit systems across the state. We're pleased to see that MDOT provided $150 million additionally in operating funding to WMATA, and we urge you to provide a full $209 million to fully close the gap so that we can avoid wage freezes, fare increases, and a deferred state of good repair needs that will adversely impact workers and transit riders. Having a strong public transit system is a key pillar of our strategy to fight the climate crisis. In fact, MDOT's own 2023 Climate Pollution Reduction Plan indicates that we need to expand public transit and active transportation strategies in order to meet our climate targets. Sierra Club also strongly believes that policies that address climate change and transition away from fossil fuels must create and maintain high-quality green jobs. We urge you to do everything you can to avoid wage freezes for WMATA workers, especially when we're facing an operator shortage. The Sierra Club strongly supports the need for a cross-jurisdictional dedicated revenue source so that we can solve the long-term revenue needs for the system. The cost of inaction will fall hardest on many households, especially without access to a vehicle. Deferring maintenance will cost longer in the long run and can result in less reliable service, meaning students could be late to class, parents might not be able to get to the job they need to support their family, and patients may miss critical medical appointments. Lost ridership could also result in more vehicles on the road, increasing pollution and vehicle crashes. The final CTP indicates there's over $1 billion in system expansion for major and minor capital projects in the State Highway Administration. MDOT and this committee should reevaluate funding for highway expansion projects in this category that would result in increased vehicle traffic. Instead, we urge you to focus on our precious dollars from our transportation budget first on system preservation and then prioritize expansion projects that will help meet the state's climate, mobility, and equity goals. Thank you.
Mrs. Mendelson, thank you. That concludes our questions, except we have one from Jared Solomon.
Yeah, just a very good question for Mr. Girardi, and thank you to your members, obviously, for doing incredible work, particularly during COVID. Can you just tell the committee how many of your members are actual Maryland residents?
Yes, I want to say about 10,000 of the 12,000.
Okay, thank you.
Of course.
Any other questions? All right. Thank you very much. We will now transition over to Maryland Department of Environment.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'll now present the Maryland Department of the Environment, or MDE's fiscal 2015 budget analysis. On page 1 there, you see the budget increases $2.8 million, or 1.3%, to $222.2 million. Jumping right into the Managing for Results exhibits, on page 9, you see that air quality is getting better. Ozone standards finally been met, which is fantastic. We might actually be seeing some clean air determinations, or clean data determinations, to actually get us to attainment status for the Washington, D.C. area and potentially even for the Baltimore area as well. For blood lead, on exhibit 2 on page 10, a couple interesting things going here. The COVID-19 pandemic led fewer people to go out and get medical services. That meant that there were fewer children that were tested for elevated blood lead levels. So you're seeing a decrease in the number of children tested, but you're seeing an increase in the reported exceedances of some of those levels, some of those thresholds that we really don't want to see. And the reason for that is because there's more testing going on in communities of kind of vulnerable populations. So it's a sampling bias issue. You go out and find the people that are more are having the challenges, and you sample them. It's going to make things look worse overall. So they're doing the right thing. Maryland Department of the Environment is doing the right thing. The question is about the sampling bias aspect to see kind of what the trend looks like over time. There are also some concerns about the reports. The subcontractor doing the work apparently did not do some vetting of the data. MDE had to do that internally, led to some delays. And therefore, DLS does recommend that MDE comments on what they're doing to make sure that we're going to have good reports going forward and how to deal with sampling bias. Third and final MFR exhibits on page 12. This addresses Public Information Act, turnaround issued within 30 days, and then responses in the permits process within the applicable standard time. What you're seeing is a slight decrease for the PIA responses, and there's no data reflected here in time for this analysis in terms of the permits process within the applicable standard time. DLS recommends that MDE comment on the trend for the PIA requests and what data is available and why it was not provided in terms of the permit turnaround time. In terms of the deficiencies, on page 13, there are three: $1 million for a comprehensive recycling needs assessment, $300,000 or so to purchase 2 shellfish monitoring boats, and around $300,000 for the implementation of the Advanced Clean Trucks regulations. Moving now to the overview of the agency, you see a large portion of the funding is in coordinating offices on page 14, around 37%. This largely reflects the debt service funding, $28 million or so in fiscal 2025, and the $20 million for the Clean Water Commerce Act, as well as some salaries as well. On page 16 is the overall budget, around $4.3 million increase under personnel expenses reflected for salary increases, around $900,000 increase for new positions. You're seeing an $855,000 reduction due to the increase in turnover rate. In terms of the kind of environmental policy components of MDE's budget, you're seeing around $3.1 million increase for stockpiles tire cleanups done by the Maryland Environmental Service. This is to hedge against potential large waste stockpile in Western Maryland. And you're seeing a $1.8 million decrease for the mining program due to funding that was not received from the Federal Infrastructure Investment Jobs Act. In terms of the one-time deficiency funding on page 17, you see around $1.6 million decrease since that funding is only provided for fiscal 2024. And then you see a reduction around $3.5 million, for the contingent reductions on the fee bill that's House Bill 245. We'll talk a little bit more about in just a second. One thing to note here, in terms of the Infrastructure Investment Jobs Act funding on page 18, DLS does recommend that MDE comment on the status of that funding, how they're doing with that. And in terms of the personnel expenditures on page 20, funding was restricted for a couple of years now in terms of trying to get MDE to submit the personnel expenditures in its sub-objects in a way that makes sense. Currently, a lot of the information is lumped in as Social Security. So you're not seeing how much is regular earnings and how much is reclassifications and all the other different subcomponents. The information, once again, was not submitted with it breakout the way it was requested. DLS recommends that language be added to require the same thing. Moving now to personnel data on page 22. See the position count includes 11 positions created by the Board of Public Works in January 2024. That funding is not reflected yet in the budget. There are 12 new positions and 1 transfer position, so a net increase of 11 positions between fiscal 24 and 2025. There are 7 contractual conversions, so no turnover necessary for those positions, and then 5 are intended to implement the Building Energy Performance Standards being developed as part of the Clean Solutions Now Act. Now we'll jump right into the issues. The first one on page 24 concerns the Tree Solutions Now Act, 5 million trees by calendar 2031. Ambitious goal. Exhibit 7 on page 25 shows how we're doing. We're on 472,000 trees so far, largely Department of Natural Resources and Maryland Department of Agriculture work. On page 26, you see that there's a lot more work that needs to be done. You need to see an exponential increase in the number of trees planted. If we're stay at the current trend, we get about 2 million of those 5 million trees. And in 2023, we actually saw fewer trees planted than we saw in fiscal 22, so it's not a good look. So we're really looking for some kind of exponential increase here. MDE notes that a substantial amount of federal funding is coming in for this purpose. DLS recommends that MDE comment on that federal funding and what's needed to get us to where we want to go. On page 27 is the second issue. This concerns funding was restricted by the General Assembly for the general permit for discharges of stormwater associated with construction activity. There are concerns that with a new permit, there might be more applicants and more permits being issued. DLS recommended that, then the General Assembly then restricted funding for a particular position. DLS recommends MD comment on the status of that position. The third issue on page 27 concerns climate change funding, the Climate Solutions Now Act. Jump really quickly here to page 28, shows you the blow-by-blow in terms of what's been done. In terms of Building Energy Performance Standards regulations, they're hoping that they're going to be completed around June 2024. There's a delay as a result of some of the work that's being done in looking at the economic impacts of those regulations. One of the things to note here, a lot more potentially covered buildings that were originally anticipated, originally around several thousand, might be around 3,000. Now it looks like there's around 9,300. So about 6,000 more potentially covered buildings. Question is, what's that impact on MDE's budget? Final greenhouse gas emission reduction plan has been submitted, around $1 billion ticket on that one. The Building Energy Emission or Transition Implementation Task Force has completed its work. The one thing that was not completed with the funding that MDE has available was the working groups as part of the Maryland Commission on Climate Change. There was a delay in that work. MDE has requested received an extension for that. However, they do know they now have enough funding for that purpose. We'll ask them to comment a little bit about that. In terms of how they're able to do this, MDE notes, because it certainly, original fiscal note was around $3.2 million in fiscal 2023 funding. So, a substantial lift for MDE without additional resources. MDE notes that it was able to leverage technical assistance from the federal government as well as its own budget in order to accomplish these concerns. But going forward, additional funding will be needed at least for building energy performance standards regulations as a result of all those new buildings that are coming online, and the compliance plans for each of those buildings as well. And obviously, there's a $1 billion price ticket overall. DLS recommends that MDE comment as noted in the middle of the page there. On page 29, the bottom of the page, compliance enforcement position quarterly reports issue. So budget bill language restricted funding until the submission of those quarterly reports. They've been submitted. The first one, at least, so the General Assembly did allow for the, instead of quarterly reports, for one report to be summarizing everything on April 2024. However, before that, the agency did submit a plan. Therefore, the information reflects what they submitted at that point. One of the kind of salient or important points here was that the reports provide for federal performance evaluation to understand what's that relationship between MDE and the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. How are we doing? One of the questions that was raised in recent years about the water supply program. We were concerned that there wasn't enough funding, enough personnel in order to be able to deal with all the issues that we have out there. Certainly, the forever chemicals being kind of in the news, certainly. So it was heartening to see that as of January 2023, MDE does retain primacy over that program as dictated by the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. DLS recommends that MDE comments, or that actually narrative be adopted to once again provide for that report. Bottom of page 30 and going forward, this covers HB 245, the fee bill that came in with the 2024 session. Big picture here, the General Assembly restricted funding until the submission of a report on the fee fines and penalties necessary to support MDE's three main administrations. The concern was the general funds were being provided to support for those administrations, which really should not be provided for. It should be provided through special funds through fees, fines, and penalties. So a report was submitted, revenues are down, expenses are up, and some of the regulated entities are going out of business, and there's a cap on the Maryland Clean Air Fund of $2 million, which means that any additional revenue coming in over that amount has to then go to the state's general fund. Then HB 245 gets to all of that. Exhibit 9 on page 33 shows that around $11.3 million in total, $10.7 million I'm going to be talking about for fiscal 25 in terms of additional revenues. The whole picture there is reflected in terms of the fiscal 29 revenue impact as well. On page 34, Exhibit 10 reflects that there's around $6.9 million more in general funds for the Land and Materials Administration than there is a contingent reduction. So the idea was administration came in with a contingent reduction saying, hey, we have this fee bill. We're going to raise fees that should allow us to reduce some of the general funds supporting these administrations. However, it doesn't seem to be calibrated in terms of $10.7 million projected revenues, but only $3.5 million in contingent reductions, and it certainly seems to be not calibrated, certainly by administration either. DLS recommends on page 35 that the agency comment on that. In terms of the report on dam safety, on page 35, legislation has been introduced to address the concerns that there are currently around 557 active dams, which 162 are dangerous or unsafe. So that was obviously a major concern for the last session. The legislation does address that by creating a private dam repair fund, and there are 5 positions that the administration would like to bring in. There's a contingent special fund appropriation for that purpose. The positions are not in the budget yet, but will be brought in as a supplemental item. DLS recommends MD comment on the overall situation for the dam safety program, what it's kind of looking forward to in terms of what its work is going to be. On page 36, the Maryland Used Tire Cleanup and Recycling Fund annual report has been submitted. DLS recommends funding be restricted again until the General Assembly receives it. And then on page 37, the requested information on both of the federal funding and also the permit violation supporting documents did not appear to be online in the format that would be most easily used. For instance, I looked up the consent decree for Back River Wastewater Treatment Plant. I was not able to find that on the OpenMDE website. The consent decree is on the website. It's just not where I would look to find it. And I also tried to look up some information about the Gore-Tex finding. I was not able to find that either. ELS recommends that NDA comment why does not comply with those particular provisions. On page 38, recommendations, $200,000 restriction for the Maryland Scrap Tire Annual Report, $200,000 restriction also until the submission of the personnel expenditures properly. And then on page 39, the report on the enforcement inspection position strength assessment. Thank you.
I failed to introduce our budget analyst, Andrew Gray, as we were trying to stay on time. So thank you, Andrew, for your presentation. And now, Secretary McElwain, if you wouldn't mind introducing who's with you today and then providing as brief a response as you can. I know we covered a lot of issues, though, in that analysis, so go ahead.
Thank you. I'll certainly cut my talking points maybe in half to catch up with time. With me, why don't you introduce yourself?
Yeah, Jeff Fretwell. I'm the acting budget director for MDE.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon, Suzanne Dorsey, Deputy Secretary.
Great. Thanks for being here today. Go ahead, Ms. Secretary.
Okay. So thank you, Madam Chair and members of the committee. So great to be here today to talk about our MDE budget. For the record, I'm Serena McElwain, Secretary of the Environment. The $222 million operating budget for fiscal year 2025 is mainly a base level. It's a baseline budget with just minor adjustments that we need to make sure that we can uphold the mission to protect land, water, and air. I just want to make a point that for my first year as secretary, my priority was really to take a real critical look at our budget and really analyze the state operations, evaluate the resources that we have, and really determine where we can improve our services and be more efficient throughout the agency, because that helps us save money and be better and do things faster and quicker. I looked into some of the concerns that were raised during some of the hearings I had when I first started last year, some of which I had no idea of. Some of those concerns were the lagging enforcement efforts that my agency had, too many extended permits, limited inspections, high vacancy rates, wastewater treatment plant issues. There's just a lot. So this budget proposal is really designed to make sure that we have the right people in the right jobs, doing the right work at the right time. In a general sense, the budget reflects a strategy where we're redirecting funds from underused programs and adjusting spending on other programs just to make sure that we do have balance and sustainability. This is a season of discipline, and this is what we're trying to do. Resources. Regarding the resources here at MDE, our agency just basically didn't have enough resources to do our jobs, to adequately run the programs. So we are really grateful for the additional positions that we got last year, which allowed us to improve the enforcement efforts in relating to the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act. We got 78 new positions, and they were diverted to some of the key programs that we have, like the climate program, enforcement, water supply, and wastewater permits. The budget proposal adds 17 additional positions, some of which will be devoted to implementing and launching the BEPS program, the Building Energy Performance Standards program, and also, as Andrew Gray stated, the dam safety program. It's really important that we have positions for the dam safety programs. We have way too many dams, way too little funding. As you said, we have over 500 dams, and a lot of them, more than 160 of them, need repair. So it's a risk, and we have to make sure we have the right amount of people and funding to take care of that. Last year, I heard also in the hearings that our fees had been too low for just way too long. So we conducted the evaluation and looked at it, and we confirmed that to be true. We had too many situations where the programs should have been self-supported and not relying on general funds. And so that's what the evaluation resulted in. And as a result, we have the omnibus fee bill proposal HB 245. And if that's approved, we can significantly reduce our reliance on general funds, and we have enough to help us cover the unfunded mandatory regulatory programs that we have. We should generate about $11 million if we are able to get the bill funded. Now I'm just going to skip along. I'll talk now about the Climate Solutions Now Act, which directed my agency to develop a plan that would ensure that we're able to meet the aggressive climate goals in that legislation. A few months ago, we released the state's first climate pollution reduction plan, which lays out that roadmap to ensure that we can meet the climate goals. And it won't be cheap. I'll just start by saying that. We all know it's a hefty price tag in order to make the plan a reality. But I do want to say that we are looking at all the ways that we can to bring in additional funding to the state to help us fund that plan, not just state funding. And we do intend to apply for a $195 million grant with the US EPA for climate pollution reduction. As you all know, the governor proposed to redirect $90 million to also offset some of the costs related to that reduction plan. In terms of the DLS analysis, thank you again, Andrew, for your thorough analysis as always. I just want to let you know that I know there were certain items we needed to respond to, including some recommendations. We submitted that in a written response, but I'm here and happy to answer any questions you may have. Thank you.
Thank you. And who would like to begin? Delegate Ruff.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. Good to see you, and thank you for your hard work. And I like that, the season of discipline. Very, very good.
Thank you.
I'll start off with just some brief question and interest that I had in your Public Information Act responses. In your response to the DLS report or analysis, you noted that you guys are taking some measures to ensure that your response process is going to remain efficient and accountable to the public. And considering the rise in the complexity of your PIA applications, can you give us more specifics on how you guys are going to, address this kind of small delay, I would say, in the responses to Public Information Act requests?
Yeah, that's important. That goes back to, like you said, the season of discipline and being efficient and making sure that we're being responsive. And so I did turn that over. I'm going to turn it over to the deputy because you were responsible for making sure that we're able to get better in that area. So why don't you just briefly describe what we've done with the physicians and everything?
Yes, under Secretary McElwain's leadership, transparency is our guide star. So our first approach is maximizing transparency. OpenMDE is a first step. We've got room to improve on that, as Mr. Gray observed in his analysis. So increasing transparency and then working on our process, our PIA process internally to make sure that we exceed the goals that we did slip on last year. Yes, sir.
And not to make too much of a complaint, but we did have literally no one in that office. We had someone leave, and then I made sure we were able to divert some some positions over in that comms area to make sure we can do what we need to do in that area.
Yeah, so that was what I was more getting at. Are you guys reallocating personnel there? Okay.
Yeah, we did. That's the first thing I approved. It's done. I think they hired the new person. Yep. So they started, and we're starting to turn things around.
And then I wanted to ask about the funding restricted for the purpose of assisting with the implementation of the new general permit for discharges of stormwater associated with construction activity. Based on your response, were you all basically just saying that the legislature, tried to anticipate something that just wasn't going to come to fruition? And if there are still potentially increases in the applications for permits, when do you think that will happen? And in turn, when do you see yourselves reallocating the position for that timely renewal of permitting?
Yes. I'm going to turn it over to Deputy. Do you want to address that? Or actually, if you don't mind, may I bring Lee, the Director of Water and
You got a
Science?
deep bench there.
Yeah,
I know. He has all the answers.
Go ahead and introduce yourself.
Yes, thank you. Good afternoon. Lee Curry, Director of Water and Science Administration, Maryland Department of the Environment.
I'm sorry, say your name one more time.
Lee Curry. Yes. Oh, and to answer your question, we right now it's that one position and also additional positions that go towards actually increasing our resources for permitting. So yes, we do anticipate that there's going to be more requests for a public comment out of that House bill that occurred. One, because that House bill requires or allows for additional public comment for projects that are in sensitive watersheds or if they're greater than a certain size. So we're increasing resources there, but also across not only that program, but our other permitting programs so we can stay on track.
I think I'll concede to my fellow delegation
Delegate
member
Edelson.
for now.
We'll come back to you, Delegate.
I don't know if it's conceding, but I'll take it. Great to see you, Madam Secretary. Thank you so much.
you.
My question is specifically about the JCR report that we had requested regarding a text alert system for environmental accidents. The report was a joint effort of MDE and MDEM, and the report sort of concluded that there are a number of different methods that we could utilize and that we're going to look at different triggers for when to use any one of those methods. It sort of ended there. So I'm wondering if you have any updates for us on what work has been done to evaluate what those triggers would be and which method would be the best. And I say this because obviously, unfortunately, environmental accidents continue to occur, and it's critical for us to be able to inform Maryland residents, one, if something has occurred, and two, what they should do as a result. And so I just want to make sure that we are really looking at this with the appropriate urgency of protecting Marylanders from environmental incidents that occur.
Well, it most certainly is urgent, and I appreciate you saying that. We have done a lot in that area. We have worked collaboratively with the other agency. Deputy, why don't you give a quick update on where we are?
Yeah, thank you. Sir, we take that quite seriously, and we have strong relationships between our emergency response team and MDEM, and depending on the type of emergency, we are confident that we will be able to trigger the appropriate response and inform the community effectively. Again, I think this continues to be an area that we are open and learning and engaged, but we do believe that we have appropriate responses developed to respond.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate that.
I'll ask a quick one here before we move on to the other side of the room. I was confused by something about on page 3, the revised fee and fine penalty structures report legislation. The last sentence in that section says, however, the contingent reductions in the budget based on passing this fee and fine bill do not appear to be calibrated to the amount of projected special fund fee revenue that would be received by each unit. Can you comment on that?
Go ahead if you want to comment.
The Secretary made decisions about where to raise fees based on a series of strategies, and those strategies involved, as she already spoke to, making sure that we can right-size our programs, economic impact, and fairness and equity. Go ahead, Secretary.
And I'll also just add that some areas where we propose to raise fees, we can't raise fees in all of the areas, right? So it's not like we could totally get rid of our reliance on general funds. So we had to be very careful, follow the law when we were proposing when and how and where and how much to increase the fees. So that's why we have that contingency that you see. Because even if we wanted to just go from 0 to 200, we had to make sure that everything is done in a way that makes sense, we legally can do, and we didn't raise fees in areas where we're not allowed to, because, we have to rely on general funds.
Okay, we may follow up with that offline, but thank you for that answer. One other question I have before we move on to Delegate Solomon is on the, I think for all the millions of people watching this hearing, could you just briefly explain what the building energy performance standards are?
Explain what the building energy standards are.
The ones that you're trying to, what is that?
Yep.
What is the purpose of them?
Okay, that's very technical. So I'm going to ask my air director to come up and explain specifically what the building energy performance standards
And
are.
before, I mean, as the context of my question is, in their legislative report, MDE says they need more funding. They need maybe as much as $1 million for the online system, and you are already getting 5 positions. And so this is a major piece of the Climate Solutions Now Act. You also have many more buildings than we originally thought. So the question I'm really asking, as you explain what it is and how that process is playing out, is do we have enough funding for what we're trying to accomplish this year?
So before you start, let me just start this conversation. And so you made some really good points. There's a new system that we need to put into place because it's 9,000 buildings. We thought it was about 3,000, 3,500 or so. It's a lot. And we don't have enough people to run that program. Like, there's no way we can run the program with the amount of people that we have. So that's why we need, one, the $1 million funding for the system to help us manage all the regulations and all that is going to be required of that industry. And we need people to do, to be there to do the job. As I said before, the right people in the right jobs doing the right work. So that's why we have that funding request as it relates to BEPS. But you can answer, if you will, please, the technical, and introduce yourself first, please.
Sure thing. Happy to. Chris Hoagland, Director of the Air and Radiation Administration. So the Building Energy Performance Standards are regulations that apply to large buildings, 35,000 square feet or greater, with certain exclusions spelled out in the Climate Solutions Now Act. And the standards require those buildings to benchmark and report their energy use starting in 2025, and then starting in 2030 to meet declining standards for greenhouse gas emissions and energy use intensity. Energy use intensity is a measure of energy efficiency. How much energy are you using per square foot? So the reporting requirements start in 2025, and then the reduction standards start in 2030.
And have you created those standards yet?
So the regulations, we proposed the regulations in December.
Okay.
The comment period ran through January. We're on track to finalize the regulations over the summer. And
so with the budget that you've been provided by the governor, what will you actually be able to accomplish in terms of this program?
Sure. So we were granted several positions last year to implement Climate Solutions Now generally, 9 positions. We devoted 3 of those to the buildings program. Those people are in place and in the office. So we now have a 3-person team working on the buildings program, doing initial setup work, finalizing the list of buildings that are covered, creating implementation stakeholder groups for building owners so we can start to educate and explain to everybody how everything's going to work. In this budget, we're requesting 5 additional positions for next year as we move to the reporting obligations coming into place. So we will have 5 positions for implementation and enforcement, in addition to the 3 that we currently have. So the request we have in this budget is to get the people in place once the requirements start to kick in to start to enforce the program. Looking forward to 2030, when the requirements shift just from reporting to reductions, we're anticipating that we will need additional positions as the buildings are working toward their reductions.
So without the $1 million you asked for the reporting system, how do you plan to move forward this year on reaching those goals?
So we will need that data starting in about 2026. So this is a system to basically interface from an existing federal tool that we chose because it's free and it's a standard tool in the industry, the EPA Energy Star Portfolio Manager. That's a federal government tool that buildings use to benchmark energy use. What we need is then a system to pull all the relevant information we need from that to use for compliance purposes. And so that's the kind of funding that we could receive in the next couple of years.
Okay, so you do not need it this year?
We don't absolutely need it this year, no.
Okay.
That's right.
Delegate Solomon, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. It's good to see you, Madam Secretary, and,
Hi,
and
good
to your
to see you.
team. And Jeff, congrats on the new role. Jeff was very helpful years ago on a lead in school drinking water bill. It's nice to see you in this new role. Just two questions for you. The first, the agency's vacancy rate is still pretty high, and a lot of the positions have been open for a while. Can you comment? Do you need more from DBM? How can you? I mean, are these positions that at some point we just need to kind of go back to the drawing board on?
Thank you for that and that observation. Well, from DBM, I don't know if you're aware, but there was a recent modernization task force where I think Secretary Tisha Edwards was the chair. I was a member of that. So we came together and we really did end the report with a lot of recommendations that will help us to bring people on board faster and quicker. There's a lot of red tape in the system and the hiring system, and I'm really hoping that with the release of that new report, we're able to bring people on board faster. I do want to say the vacancy rate is higher, but it's lower than it was when I started. If you take out the fact that people left and we had to backfill, our vacancy rate went down by 3 to 4%. But we just, as we bring on all these folks, which we did, and it was fast, I cleaned up some of the processes internally that I had authority to clean up myself, and it helped. But with retirements and people turning over, it seemed like we were fighting a losing battle because people were leaving. But we're starting to catch up, and we're making sure that if we can just get people, because the hiring process itself is improving and it's going to get better. But we have to figure out a way to offset the number of people who are retiring. And it's a lot. They've been with us for 35 years is the average. It was a long time.
I was going to say, I think it'd be helpful because I know the DLS report mentioned that there was a coding error on some of these, that some of them say they've been vacant since 2001, which obviously is not the case. I think just getting a sense of what's old, because we're working on some legislation around the personnel report, and Secretary Edwards and the DBM folks have been amazing and great partners on it. But we just want to make sure that if there's more you need, or if these are positions that are older. And then sort of more broadly, shifting gears a little bit, I'm curious if you can share with us maybe some previews on the PFAS report for public water treatment, and then I don't know if your team has had an opportunity to read the Baltimore Sun report that came out, and I'm still willing to praise the Baltimore Sun. It was great reporting on the Gore-Tex case. As I guess I will just say, I was a little bit dismayed in reading it. It seemed like the agency was satisfied with what Gore-Tex has done, yet some of the reporting made it seem like the PFAS contamination could have been significantly more widespread. Again, it's just a report, but would just be curious to hear your comments on where we are with the public water treatment plants, because I'm getting concerns raised by constituents. I think we're just generally concerned about PFAS. And then if you could talk maybe more specifically about the department's response to the Gore-Tex.
Yeah, there's been a lot of work in terms of dealing with that issue. So you have all the technical information behind it. So why don't I turn that over to you, Director Corey? Okay.
No, thank you. Thanks for the question and the interest in PFAS. Lee Curry again, Director of Water and Science. With respect to public water systems serve almost 90% of our population. Really important to us. We have monitored for PFAS at all of those public water systems. There's more than 400. We've detected elevated levels above what is EPA's draft drinking water standard. They haven't finalized that rule yet, at about 60 locations. Now, we've also have received some significant federal infrastructure funding that is helping resolve the problem. So what we're doing right now is connecting those dollars with the communities. Just this past year, we funded 13 communities, and we're out working with the next 13 on that list. And the way we're prioritizing is we're looking at communities that have the highest levels of PFAS, and then we're dealing with those first, because that would be the highest potential risk.
Okay, so that's great. And then if you could comment on the Gore-Tex piece.
Sure. Yeah. So Tyler Abbott, I'm the Director of the Land and Materials Administration.
Excuse me.
And part of my program, I oversee the land restoration program, and that does they oversee the investigations for these type of issues. So with the situation with Gore, we have an active investigation going on right now in partnership with Gore. We are reviewing all the sampling plans. We're working with them to make sure that the targeted areas that we are interested in are getting tested, and we even took some on our own to make sure that we were testing even outside of where Gore was willing to test. As part of this program, that is kind of how it works, and we have appreciated the partnership so far. Where we are right now isn't where necessarily we are going to be down the road. There's a lot more work to do. There's a lot more characterization to do, and then also still working with our federal partners on what those federal limits are going to be in drinking water. So we have a lot of progress still to go, but I think that we've really made great progress in Cecil County as well as other parts of the state as well.
Thank you. I'm curious to get an update as that continues. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Delegate Mangione.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Madam Secretary, and your team for being here. I unfortunately agree that I do think it's going to be very expensive to implement some of these things in the Climate Solutions Now Act. And that brings me back, Madam Chair mentioned the Building Energy Performance Standard regulations. So I just want to make sure, number one, I know the gentleman touched on some of it. I just want to make sure I understand this correctly, that so the agency's going to need more funding to keep track of over 9,000 plus buildings that I guess meet this criteria.
Correct.
And some of the criteria you're basically saying is along the lines, I guess for somebody, not an expert in any of this, would be electrifying most of this stuff. So, I can't even imagine how much that's going to cost some of these landowners, these property owners, to have to basically overhaul anything from HVAC to, I guess, water heating systems, all that. And if that's not done, and by a certain time, then there's going to be a fine imposed on them. Is that how I'm understanding this?
That is correct. But what we've been saying, and it's true, is there is a fine, but we're going to work really closely with industry, and we don't intend to impose a fine based on all that we have to do. There's a regulatory process we have to go through. We're also going to, I think it's a year that we evaluate the program and see where we are, and then we can adjust. But yes, there is a potential fine, but again, we are working really hard to make sure that's not an issue.
Okay, and I guess that's some of my concern. If we go back to the previous hearing, for example, WMATA implemented, and probably a good idea at the time with COVID, that they wouldn't have rider fees. So my concern also would be, at a time with online working, something like COVID, for example, did a ton of damage to the property, I guess commercial property. How are you having those conversations with people that are not finding the tenants? They may just be doing stuff during Zoom. Lots of business or property owners are trying to figure out how they use this space that is not renting. And matter of fact, it's a nationwide issue of some of these commercial space. So how are those discussions going with something like this that could be so expensive?
Sure. And so the legislation first required us to include an alternative compliance fee. So before there would be any fines or penalties, which come when you don't comply with the regulation, there would be an opportunity to pay a fee in lieu of meeting the standard. And that effectively serves as capping the costs that anybody would face.
So that's a one-time fee or an ongoing thing?
That would be an annual. Any year in which you miss the greenhouse gas standard, you can pay this fee rather than complying with the standard itself. But then we included some other provisions in the proposed regulation, exemptions for buildings with low vacancy rates when building owners face financial hardship, exemptions and special provisions for certain building categories, for example, affordable housing. And then I think outside of the regulation itself, there's lots of work to mobilize resources for building owners to make the upgrades. The governor announced on Friday additional funding in the budget, a good chunk of which is for buildings, many of which will be covered by the Building Energy Performance Standards. So we know that long term we want to look at funding sources to help defray the costs of the renovations, which would be substantial. We estimated that in the regulation. The good news is that over time these things pay for themselves, but of course there's an upfront cost to get over at the top.
There's two really quick follow-ups, if you don't mind. Thank you, Madam Chair. Would be, what were those fees that you were expecting in terms of a dollar figure if they're not meeting those standards on a yearly basis? And then my other question, I guess, with all this electric, is there current MDE, I guess, studies that are underway or on whether or not the electric grid can handle now? Because, I mean, your own estimates said that this was 9,259, and that's more than 3 times, I guess, what you expected. So that's a lot. I mean, these are big buildings, too. So if you can just touch on them. And thank you very much for your answer.
Thank you. I'll address and you can follow up and continue, but regarding the grid issue, the PSC, they conducted a study, and I think it was concluded about a couple months ago, and it found that there is enough capacity on the grid to handle all that we've laid out in the Climate Solutions Now Act, as well as the Climate Reduction Plan. So from that study, where there's capacity to allow us to do, as Maryland, as a state, to do what we need to do. I'll turn it over to you for the PEPs.
And as part of the regulatory analysis for this regulation, we then had a deeper dive on the grid impacts of just these buildings complying with this standard. So just
assuming
this subset
all
of
9,000
buildings.
did.
That's right. And so we found that if the buildings meet simultaneously the greenhouse gas reduction standard in the regulation as well as the energy efficiency, that it would lessen impacts on the grid compared to the current usage of those buildings. So we would reduce the peak demand from those buildings if they pursue the energy efficiency in the regulation, and we would prevent the challenge from building electrification, which is that we're increasing winter demand potentially to a point that's higher than the summer demand, which is what we build the grid out for today. So we found that by pairing the greenhouse gas standards with energy efficiency standards in the regulation, we actually reduced those peak demands on the electrical grid while electrifying the buildings to reduce their emissions.
And that fee, real quick. If you just
And the fee, so per the Climate Solutions Now Act, we have to set the alternative compliance fee no lower than the social cost of greenhouse gases established by the EPA. This is an economic metric estimating the damage to society from emitting 1 ton of carbon dioxide. EPA revised those estimates last year, and we incorporated them into the proposed regulation. So out through in 2030, I believe it's in the neighborhood of $230 per metric ton of carbon dioxide.
Thank you.
Thank you. And Delegate Ruff, go ahead.
For a second bite at the apple, Madam Chair. I wanted to talk about the lead poisoning prevention program, reporting about the increase in 2021 to children who are indicating higher blood lead levels, and the indication from DLS about sampling bias. Do I take it from the report that, based on what you're talking about, the program's epidemiologists providing analysis results of screening at the county and census tract level, that you don't believe that there's bias, and if or any sampling bias, and if that's the case, then are we saying, or are you, is it the result that sampling or testing was not as fulsome or as equitable across the state previously, which is marking the rise in elevated blood levels in children?
I'm going to let Tyler respond, but let me say this. There was a lot of variables into play when you think about the sampling. COVID had a lot to do with it. There was also a big push to have more children tested than before. So that's going to make it look like, you know, the results are different because of that extra campaign to get more people, more children tested. But I'll let you explain that a little more.
Right. I mean, before you do that,
Yep.
I think to me it seems like there's not bias, right? That
Correct.
we're just testing more people,
Correct.
and we're having the ability to show that the testing we had done, that we were doing before, was not adequate, and did not accurately capture the level of elevated blood levels. And this is really important in Baltimore City, which I represent, because of the concentrated nature of high elevated, lead content that you guys are doing through your X-ray vision, super special powers that you have to locate these things. So
Correct.
I guess how does that then impact the work that we're doing to remediate this scourge that has existed, like my brother said here, since the 70s?
Yes. Please.
Sure. So one thing to also think about when we're looking at data, and you're going to see different results next year as well. So we are continuing to see CDC lower the action level for elevated blood lead levels. So we went from 10 micrograms per deciliter only 5 years ago to 5, and now we're seeing 3.5 micrograms per deciliter. So our action level is getting lower. You're going to see more testing, and you're going to see more investigations on our side. With the increased investigations, we're really going to make sure that we get into the community, perform those tests that are needed, make sure we bring out our X-ray vision, and we're making sure that those walls, the paint that is affected is contained, make sure that there's no risk to the kids, and make sure that if there are risks, that we're bringing those to the attention of the parents. When we get down to these lower levels, it's not just the paint that's inside the house, it's also in toys, it's, as we saw, in baby food, and so there's a lot of different factors that we have to look at, and we're going to continue increasing enforcement efforts. You saw that as part of our proposal in the fee bill. We're also trying to increase funding to that program as well to make sure that we're going to just keep ramping up our investigations. And so we're going to do our best to make sure we're getting into every home of every affected kid and really making a difference.
Yeah, well, I encourage you all to continue getting the real numbers because the people in my district, in Baltimore City especially, are going to need to know how to handle this situation and what the real deal is because we don't want fluffed information.
Certainly.
My last question would be to the tree planting goals. Can you guys give us a more detailed plan on how you all intend to, get to that $5 million goal number considering the current trajectory?
Right.
Did I say 5 million?
$5 million.
What did I say? Yeah, 5 million. Sorry, 5 million trees.
Right. We're going to try and meet that number, but I will say, and I'll turn it over to you, Suzanne, because I know that's actually your program. It does, when you look at the charts, it does show that it might be difficult for us to get from 2 million to 5 million based on the trend. It's going to take more funding, and we're pursuing more funding, federal funding. We're working with the Department of Agriculture, Natural Resources to figure out ways to make sure we get more funding in so that we can meet that goal. It's not going to be easy. That is a true fact. But it's a goal that we need to meet, and we're going to try to meet that goal. But again, it requires more money for us to plant more trees. But did I miss anything?
No, I thank you, and thank you for that question. And the Secretary, this is near and dear to my heart. I want to lift up our partners at the Chesapeake Bay Trust who leveraged $33 million in federal funding in our communities affected with EJ concerns as an example of how we need to get to exponential, as Andrew Gray said. So there's a lot of work left to be done. We appreciate your partnership and engagement on that, and it's a challenge we intend to meet or exceed with the Secretary's leadership.
Make sure you guys lean on those Blue Water folks too.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
We shall.
Okay, we have one last question for you, and Vice Chair Edelson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So I wanted to sort of follow up on Delegate Ruff's question, but start just by saying I found the PSC report pretty exciting that as we increase our use of renewable sources, it actually decreases the impact on the grid over time. I thought that was great. I would just caution us to not be so worried about ACP impact on industries that we end up setting them so low that it doesn't actually incentivize anybody to make the change. We're having that issue right now in our solar arena, right? Because it's ultimately so low that it's depressing the SREC market and resulting in utility providers not actually being incentivized to create utility level solar because they just pay the ACPs. On a broader level, I like to have a sense of how it is that we plan to achieve the goals of the Climate Solutions Now Act from a financial perspective, outside of if the expectation is simply general fund deficiency appropriations to get there. There's a lot of unfunded needs that we have. It's a very aggressive plan. I think many of us in the room would agree that it is the plan that we need to do our best to save our planet for future generations. So how do we get there? How do we achieve it financially?
Well, that's two questions. So how do we,
Sure.
so if you're asking how do we achieve it financially without the financial help, is that what you're asking?
I guess I'm trying to get a sense of, is the way that we see to get there through general fund deficiency appropriations, or are there other methods that we can add into the mix to help us get there?
Yeah, so in the climate pollution reduction plan, we outlined 6 different options and areas to consider. And one of them was, well, it was a lot of them. So cap and invest was on there. There was an option to pursue a green revenue bond. And there was a few other options on there. We have to pursue funding options outside of taxing the taxpayer to pay for this plan that we have. And we plan to work very closely with you all, with the General Assembly, to figure out which options are doable. What can we do? But we need to do something. We cannot rely on general funds or taxpayers to help us fund this pollution reduction plan. We just can't. There are some things we can do that we don't need funding for, and that's why I'm going to turn it over to you in terms of regulations that we can pursue that gets us to where we need to be. Is that going to get us to meeting all the goals? No. We need the whole package. We need the funding and all the different steps that we outlined. You want to just share quickly some of the things we can do without the funding?
Sure. So in the climate plan laid out some immediate steps we'll take while we work towards sustainable long-term funding sources, including additional regulations on the MDE side. So we'll be updating our regional greenhouse gas initiative regulations. This is the carbon cap and invest program for power plants that we do with other East Coast states. So we're setting the future course of that program now in deliberation with the other states. And so strengthening that regulatory program will be one of our near-term actions. We're also considering additional regulations called a clean heat standard, which would mobilize investment in building decarbonization outside of just the big buildings for the Building Energy Performance Standard, as well as zero-emission equipment heating standards to phase in new zero-emitting equipment later in the decade.
Thanks so much.
And I think that's a question that, it's a good question to end on. We will be discussing that every year and working together to try to figure out the funding sources. With that, committee members, those of you that need to go to that 3 p.m. meeting, please go ahead and run down there. They're waiting for you. And thank you, Secretary McElwain, and all of you from MDE. We appreciate the work that you're doing, and we are adjourned.
Thank you.